David Miller had learned, over 20 long years, that grief does not end. It simply learns to wear a different face. And if you're watching this and you've ever lost someone you loved, someone you never got to say goodbye to properly, I want you to stay with me until the end of this story, because what happened to David on an ordinary Saturday morning at the Ashwood Farmers Market will remind you that some goodbyes are lies, and some miracles arrive 20 years too late, but they still arrive. If this story moves you even a little, do me a favor and hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. Stories about broken families finding their way back to each other. Now, let's begin. The autumn air smelled like cinnamon and wet leaves the morning everything changed. David, 58 years old, with silver gray hair cropped close and a face that had weathered 2 decades of solitary parenting, pushed his cart past a stall of pumpkins, half listening to the church bells ringing 3 blocks away. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He never was anymore. Since his son Daniel had moved out for college 6 years ago, David's Saturdays had become a quiet ritual. Coffee, market, a walk by the river, and then the long silence of a house built for a family of 3 that now held only 1. He had built that silence carefully, the way a man builds a wall stone by stone, not because he wanted to keep people out, but because he no longer trusted what happened when the wall came down. 20 years ago, David had buried his wife, Emily. He remembered the closed casket. He remembered the funeral director telling him gently that after the accident, an open casket wouldn't be advisable. He remembered standing in the rain in a black suit that suddenly felt too big for him, holding the hand of a 5-year-old boy who kept asking when mommy was coming home, and not having an answer that wouldn't break the boy's heart. David had never remarried. He told people it was because no one could replace Emily. The truth, quieter and harder to admit, was that some part of him had never actually believed she was gone, and a man cannot build a new life on top of a question he's too afraid to ask. That Saturday, weaving between the flower stand and the honey vendor, David felt something shift in the air, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. He looked up, and his entire body went still. Across the market square, near the apple stand, stood a woman, 55 maybe. Chestnut hair streaked with silver, pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping around a face that time had softened but not erased. She wore a long beige coat, her hands tucked into the pockets, and she was laughing at something. That same laugh, low and a little crooked at the end, the laugh David had fallen in love with 30 years ago in a college library when she'd snorted after telling a joke, and then pretended she hadn't. It was a laugh he had memorized the way other men memorize scripture. It was Emily's laugh. David's coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered against the cobblestones, and he didn't even notice. Beside the woman stood a young woman, maybe 20 years old, with chestnut hair like the older woman's, but a jawline, a posture, a way of tilting her head when she listened that belonged unmistakably to David himself. And her eyes, David's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were his own, the exact shade of warm, deep brown that his mother used to say looked like coffee held up to firelight. He had looked into a mirror with those eyes every single day of his life. He had never in 20 years seen them looking back at him from another face. Until now. For a long moment, David could not move. The market noise fell away. The vendors calling out prices, the children laughing near the face-painting booth, the distant hum of the highway. All of it dissolved into a ringing silence, and all David could hear was his own heartbeat slamming against his ribs like something trying to escape. "Emily," he said. It came out as barely more than a breath. The woman turned, and when her eyes found his, the color drained from her face. Her lips parted. The apple she'd been holding fell from her hand and rolled beneath the stall. "David," she whispered. And in that single word, 20 years collapsed into nothing. To understand what happened next, you have to go back. You have to understand who David and Emily Miller were before the world tore them apart. They had met at 22, in the fluorescent-lit basement of a university library, both reaching for the same worn copy of a poetry anthology. Emily was studying literature and wanted to teach. David was finishing an engineering degree and secretly wrote terrible poems he never showed anyone, except, eventually, her. They married 3 years later in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard. String lights hung between the oak trees, her father crying more than anyone. David used to say that marrying Emily was the only decision in his life he never once doubted. Daniel was born 4 years into their marriage, a stubborn, colicky baby who grew into a stubborn, gentle boy who worshipped his mother. Emily taught high school English 3 streets from their house, and David worked as a structural engineer for a firm downtown. They weren't wealthy, they weren't famous, they were, by every account that mattered, happy. The kind of happy that doesn't announce itself, that simply exists in the small rituals of ordinary life. Pancakes on Sunday mornings, arguments over whose turn it was to do dishes, Emily reading bedtime stories in funny voices until Daniel begged her to stop laughing so he could actually fall asleep. Then came the accident. Emily had left for a teachers' conference 2 towns over, driving alone at night on a rain-slicked highway. The police report said her car had gone off the road near a ravine and into the river below. They said the currents were strong that time of year. They searched for 4 days. On the 5th day, they told David they were calling off the search, that given the conditions, recovery was unlikely, and that he should begin making arrangements. There was no body. There was, in the end, only a name on a headstone and a folded flag of grief that David carried alone for the next 2 decades, raising a 5-year-old boy who cried himself to sleep for a year, asking why Mommy hadn't come to say goodbye. David never spoke about how those years nearly broke him. He went to work. He came home. He learned to braid hair for a kindergarten picture day because there was no one else to do it. He sat through parent-teacher conferences alone, coached a baseball team he knew nothing about because Daniel wanted to play, and cried quietly in the shower on nights when the loneliness became a physical weight pressing on his chest. He told himself over and over that this was simply what life had become, and that a man's job was to keep walking even when the road ahead looked like nothing but gray. There had been women over the years who tried, a colleague from the firm who brought him casseroles for a full year after the funeral, and eventually admitted she'd hoped for more than friendship. A kind, divorced mother from Daniel's Little League team who asked him to coffee twice before quietly giving up. David always found a reason to decline, a reason he told himself was grief, and never once questioned might be something closer to instinct. A stubborn, unexplainable feeling in his chest that something about Emily's death had never added up, that the story he'd been told didn't fit the woman he'd known. He never voiced that feeling out loud, not even to his closest friends, because grief that refuses to resolve itself starts to look, to everyone on the outside, like a man who simply can't let go. So David buried the feeling along with everything else, and told himself that a good father doesn't chase ghosts. A good father shows up. He went to every school play, even the ones where Daniel had a single line and forgot half of it. He learned to sew a Halloween costume from a video tutorial at 11 at night. He sat alone in waiting rooms during Daniel's appendix surgery at 14, gripping the arms of a plastic chair so hard his knuckles went white, wishing more than anything that there was another parent beside him to share the terror. There never was. There was only David, and the quiet, and the photograph of Emily on the mantel that he dusted every Sunday without fail. 20 years running. What David did not know, what he could not have known, was that 400 miles away, in a small coastal town under a name that wasn't hers, Emily Miller had been alive the entire time. Now, standing in the middle of the Ashwood Farmers Market, 20 years of unanswered questions rose in David's throat all at once, and he couldn't decide whether to embrace this woman or scream at her. "You're alive," he said, his voice cracking. "You're Emily. You're standing right here. 20 years. 20 years I stood at a grave that had nothing in it. 20 years I told our son his mother was dead." Emily's eyes filled instantly with tears, and she reached toward him, then stopped herself, her hand hovering in the space between them, as though she didn't believe she had the right to touch him anymore. "David, I know what I took from you. I have rehearsed this conversation 10,000 times in my head, and there has never once been a version where it doesn't sound monstrous." It was the young woman beside her who spoke next, her voice trembling. "My name is Grace," she said, looking directly at David with his own eyes staring back at him. "I'm 20 years old, and I think—" her voice broke. "I think you might be my father." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, gripping the edge of the apple stall for balance. Grace, 20 years old, which meant Emily had been pregnant when she disappeared, though she herself may not have known it yet, or had known and never had the chance to say. David looked at her for a long moment, and then at Grace, whose eyes, his eyes, were pleading with him in a way that undid something rigid in his chest that had been holding for 20 years. He thought of every year he'd told himself the ache in his chest was simply the shape grief takes when it never quite finishes its work. He thought of every unanswered question he'd forced himself to stop asking, because a man can only stare into an empty grave so many times before he has to look away or lose his mind entirely. And now the answer to all of it was sitting 3 feet away from him on a bench that hadn't existed 20 years ago, in a market that hadn't existed 20 years ago, in a life that had rebuilt itself brick by careful brick without her. And yet here she was, breathing, aging, real. "Please," Emily said, tears now streaming freely down her face. "There's a bench by the fountain. Give me 20 minutes. Just 20 minutes, David. After 20 years. And if you want to, walk away after that. I will never come near you or Daniel again. But please, let me explain." They sat on that bench while the market carried on obliviously around them. Pigeons pecking at crumbs, children laughing on a carousel nearby, and Emily told David the truth she had carried alone for 2 decades. She had not gone off the road by accident. Weeks before the crash, Emily had discovered something she was never supposed to see: financial records proving that the school district superintendent, a man with dangerous connections outside of education, was laundering money through falsified construction contracts, the very contracts tied to David's engineering firm. When Emily confronted a colleague about irregularities in the paperwork, she was warned, quietly and unmistakably, that continuing to ask questions would put her family in danger. She hadn't believed it, not fully, until the night her brake lines were tampered with on the same stretch of road where, officially, her car went into the river. She had survived. Barely. A stranger, a retired nurse living alone near the ravine, had pulled her from the water, unconscious and freezing, and nursed her back to health in a cabin with no phone line. By the time Emily was strong enough to think clearly, federal investigators, alerted by the very documents she'd stumbled onto, had already begun building a case, and they told her something that would define the next 20 years of her life if she resurfaced too soon. Before the case was airtight, she and her family would be in far greater danger than before. The people involved had already tried to kill her once. They would not hesitate to finish what they started, and they would not hesitate to hurt David or 5-year-old Daniel to send a message. "I wanted to come home every single day," Emily said, her hands shaking around David's, which he had not pulled away. "I begged them to let me contact you. They told me the moment I did, I would be putting a target on Daniel's back. I couldn't live with that. I decided I would rather you hate a dead woman than bury a 5-year-old boy." She discovered she was pregnant with Grace 2 months after the accident. She gave birth alone, under witness protection, in a small hospital 3 states away, raising their daughter in secrecy while investigators slowly, painstakingly built a case against men who had eyes on every road leading back to David's town. She said she used to drive 4 hours every few years, just to sit in her car outside Daniel's school and watch him walk out with his backpack, just to know he was safe, just to remember his face before disappearing again before anyone noticed her. Those years were not easy for Emily, either, and she wanted David to understand that her survival had never once felt like freedom. She described the coastal town where the Marshalls relocated her. Gray winters, a small apartment above a laundromat, a job at a diner where she wore a name tag that said Anne, and flinched every time a customer's headlights swept across the window at night. She described the panic attacks that came without warning in grocery store aisles, the years of therapy sessions conducted in a windowless federal building because it wasn't safe to see a local doctor, the birthday cards she wrote for Daniel every single year and was never allowed to send, stacked now in a shoebox in her closet, 20 of them, unopened by the boy they were meant for. She described teaching Grace to ride a bicycle in an empty church parking lot at dawn, alone, because there was no one else to hold the back of the seat and cheer her on, and how every small milestone Grace reached, her first steps, her first day of school, her high school graduation, arrived for Emily wrapped in the same quiet grief, a triumph she couldn't call David to share. "I watched him graduate high school from across the parking lot," she whispered. "I watched you stand there alone, so proud, and I have never wanted anything more in my life than to walk up and stand beside you. I couldn't. Not until 3 weeks ago, when the case finally closed, when the last of the men who threatened us were sentenced, and the federal marshal called and told me I was free. Truly free, for the first time in 20 years. She told him about the night everything unraveled, how she'd stayed late at the district office to finish grading, and stumbled across an invoice for a school gymnasium renovation billed at nearly triple its actual cost. The difference funneled through a shell company registered to the superintendent's brother-in-law. How she'd mentioned it, innocently, to a fellow teacher the next morning, not knowing the teacher reported everything back to the front office. How, 3 days later, a man she'd never seen before sat in a car across from the school for 6 straight hours, doing nothing but watching. How she told herself she was being paranoid, right up until the night her brakes failed on a road she'd driven 1,000 times. Grace spoke then, quietly. "I grew up thinking my father died before I was born. That's what we told everyone, to protect you and Daniel. My mother never remarried. She never even looked at another man. She kept a photograph of you in her nightstand my entire childhood, and some nights I'd catch her just sitting there, holding it, crying, and not explaining why. I didn't understand until I was 16 and she finally told me the truth, that I had a father and a brother alive, only a few hundred miles away, and we could never go to them until it was safe." David sat in silence for a long time, his mind trying to hold 20 years of assumed grief against 20 years of a hidden, protected love that had never actually died. It had simply been forced underground, forced into shadows, forced to watch from a distance while pretending not to exist. He thought about every lonely dinner, every silent car ride home from Daniel's baseball games. Every year he told himself that loving Emily had been a chapter that closed too soon. And now here she was, having loved him just as fiercely the entire time, from 400 miles away, through a fence of danger she had built entirely to keep her family breathing. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't hurt," David finally said, his voice raw. "I buried you, Emily. I built a whole life around missing you, instead of having you. I don't know how to just erase that." "I'm not asking you to erase it," Emily said. "I'm asking you to let me spend whatever time I have left trying to make up for it, even if that just means being in the same city, even if it just means Grace gets to know her brother, even if you never forgive me completely. I would rather have a small piece of this family back than none of it." Emily reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small, worn photograph. David at 25, laughing on their wedding day, the edges soft from 20 years of handling. "I carried this everywhere," she said. "Every apartment, every town, every name that wasn't mine. It was the one thing I refused to let them take from me." David took it from her hands, and for the first time since she'd said his name across the market square, he let himself cry. Not the controlled private grief he'd rationed out over 2 decades, but something larger, something that had been waiting 20 years for permission. It was Daniel, called to the market in a frantic, tear-streaked phone call from his father, who arrived 45 minutes later and stood frozen at the edge of the fountain, staring at a mother he had mourned since he was 5 years old, and a sister he had never known existed. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and wrapped his arms around Emily so tightly that she gasped, both of them sobbing into each other's shoulders, while market-goers slowed to watch, sensing they were witnessing something they would never fully understand but could feel the weight of anyway. Grace stood a little apart, watching her brother meet her for the first time, until Daniel pulled back, wiped his face, and turned to her. "You have Dad's eyes," he said, half laughing through his tears. "That's insane." "Everyone says that," Grace said, and for the first time that day she smiled. David's smile, unmistakably the same crooked lift at the corner of the mouth that Daniel had inherited too. In the weeks that followed, healing did not arrive all at once, the way it never does in real life. There were long nights of David and Emily sitting on the porch, working through 20 years of grief and anger and questions that had no clean answers. There were moments David needed to walk away, to sit alone by the river and remember the boy he'd raised without her, to grieve the years no reunion could ever return to him. Emily never once asked him to move faster than his heart could carry him. She simply stayed, showing up the way she had always wanted to and never been allowed, proving with each ordinary Tuesday dinner and each Sunday morning coffee that this time, she wasn't going anywhere. Grace moved into the guest room down the hall from the bedroom that had once been hers as a 5-year-old's future nursery, dreamed of but never lived in. She and Daniel became inseparable within a month, staying up late comparing childhoods that had run in strange, sad parallel 400 miles apart. A mother's absence on one side, a father's absence on the other, both of them shaped by a lie they never asked for but had to carry anyway. There was one evening about 2 months in, when the fragile peace nearly broke. David had been going through an old box in the garage and found Daniel's kindergarten backpack, the one Emily had picked out the week before the accident, still smelling faintly of crayons and glue. He sat on the garage floor for an hour, unable to move. And when Emily found him there, he finally let 20 years of controlled, quiet grief break loose all at once. He shouted at her, not cruelly, but with a rawness that had been sealed shut since the funeral, asking how she could have let him believe, for even one single day, that Daniel's mother was dead, when there might have been another way, any other way, to protect them without erasing herself so completely from their lives. Emily didn't defend herself. She sat down on the garage floor beside him and let him say every furious, heartbroken word he needed to say, and when he finally ran out of anger and simply wept instead, she put her arms around him the way she used to 20 years ago, and neither of them spoke for a long time. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first night David let her hold him, and somehow that mattered more than any apology could have. Grace and Daniel, meanwhile, were building something neither of them had ever had, a sibling. They spent hours at the kitchen table trading stories that mirrored each other in strange, sad ways. Daniel describing a father who never missed a school event, but always looked a little haunted in photographs. Grace describing a mother who built an entire second life around protecting children she couldn't see grow up. They discovered they had both, independently, taught themselves to play the same 3 chords on second-hand guitars. They discovered they both hated cilantro and loved thunderstorms. Small things, ordinary things, the exact kind of things that a family builds itself out of. One dinner table conversation at a time, and the very things that 20 years of separation had stolen from all four of them without asking permission. 6 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning that felt almost unbearably ordinary, David stood at the kitchen counter making pancakes, a recipe he hadn't touched in 20 years, while Emily set the table and Grace argued with Daniel about whose turn it was to do the dishes, an argument David realized with a lump rising in his throat he had once had with Emily in this very kitchen a lifetime ago. He looked around at the 4 plates on the table, the coffee brewing, the late morning light falling gold across the floor, and understood, finally, that some stories don't end where the world tells you they should. Some families are broken not by love failing, but by love being forced into hiding for the sake of survival. And if you're patient enough, if you're brave enough to answer the door 20 years later, sometimes that love finds its way back home. David never got those 20 years back. No reunion, however miraculous, can undo 2 decades of a father raising a son alone at a grave that held nothing, or a mother watching her children grow up through a car window, unable to say the words she'd been holding for a lifetime. But what David learned, standing in that kitchen with pancake batter on his hands and his entire family, the family he thought he'd buried, gathered around one table again, was that it is never too late to choose each other. A year after that first morning at the farmer's market, David stood in the backyard where he and Emily had married 3 decades earlier. String lights hung once again between the same 2 oak trees, now grown taller and wider than either of them remembered. This time, there was no ceremony, no vows exchanged, just a quiet dinner to celebrate Grace's college acceptance, and Daniel, 26 now, raising a toast to a family that had somehow found its way back from the impossible. Emily caught David's eye across the table, and in that look past everything 20 years of separation couldn't erase, the same 2 people who'd once reached for the same book in a university library. Older now, scarred now, but choosing each other again anyway, on purpose, in the daylight, with nothing left to hide. Grief had taught David how to survive alone. Emily's return taught him something harder and far more valuable: how to let love back in, even after it had broken his heart in ways he never fully recovered from. And if there is one thing David Miller would want you to take from his story, it is this: the people we've lost are not always as far away as the silence makes them feel, and sometimes the family you thought was gone forever is only ever a Saturday morning away from finding you again.